say they're at odds. They just have varying opinions. No blows have been struck yet. Well, again, it is a wonderful pleasure and an honor to be with you. I believe this is my fourth or fifth visit to this round table over the course of my career. It is always a pleasure to come back. I do have one disclaimer to put out there first. I will be taking questions at the end of the program. You are welcome to ask, except for Mr. Hewitt, who knows more about Louisiana than I do. He's excluded from asking me questions, and I may not know the answer. That's a compliment to you, Larry.
Take it that way and be quiet.
Can't catch me in the bar later. What I want to talk to you about tonight, when I was here 6 months ago, we talked about the fall of New Orleans and the capture of New Orleans. I'll do a quick refresher on that in a few moments. But what I want to explain to you is why Butler. Butler is probably one of the most maligned and less thought of generals of the Civil War, especially on the Union side. What drew me to him? Well, the story's kind of interesting. I arrived in Louisiana, where I would spend 10 years of my career in the late 1980s. Shortly after my arrival, Bill Hyland, a good friend of mine from St. Bernard Parish that Larry may know, parish historian for St. Bernard Parish, took me to dinner to a plantation home upriver from New Orleans, still owned by the same family that owned it at the time of the Civil War. In the middle of this dinner, the children of the family came bursting into the room, interrupting the adults, and were just running amok through the whole room, followed very shortly by their babysitter. Babysitter's yelling at them, the parents are yelling at them, and the kids are like, eh. Then the babysitter turned and said, "You behave now, or I am going to see to it that General Butler comes tonight and takes you away." The reaction of those children, you would have thought they had mentioned the boogeyman. Those children snapped to, left the room, and we never heard from them again the rest of the evening. And I said to myself, how can this be? How can a guy who is not a very good military general, who was here for only 7 months, how could he still possibly instill this kind of reaction in a family? And so I began to research more and more. And the more I discovered and fell in love with New Orleans and with Louisiana, I began to realize that even this is really the main mission of my talk tonight. It's not to change your opinions of Butler. That's always going to be controversial. But to understand why he did what he did. And by doing that, I believe he saved lives, protected lives, and saved the city of New Orleans from possible complete destruction. And that to allow us to have the beautiful city that we have today. Now, the bad part about studying in Butler in rather details is I picked up some very bad habits. I don't know why, but I have this insatiable urge to kind of collect. I should see the spoon collection I have. But anyway, the gentleman who did the quiz did an absolutely magnificent job. Now, basically, I could leave. He did my program. But now we're going to talk about some of these things in greater detail. Let's go back real quickly, though, and talk about New Orleans. Why was New Orleans so important to both the Confederacy and the Union? Does anybody remember from September how big, where it ranked in size in cities of the Confederacy? Are the largest. 3 times larger than the second largest city in the Confederacy, which was a tie between what 2 communities? Richmond and Charleston. Exactly. Somebody was actually listening in September. Basically, 170,000 people from all over the face of the earth lived in New Orleans in 1861-62. In 1860, it had port receipts of over $186 million, $110 million of that in cotton. It had 13 major banks, $24 million in capital, $12 million in gold, numerous factories and other resources desperately needed by a Confederacy lacking those type of resources. The Union plan to chain the Mississippi Valley was basically to cut the Confederacy in 2. The Confederates made the mistake, Jeff Davis at the top of that list, of honestly believing that the Union threat would come from upriver and would come downriver. And so resources of New Orleans, men, munitions, ships, were all funneled to the north to stop the main Union thrust. They didn't really pay the necessary attention to the southern approach until it was too late. The Confederate forces in New Orleans felt they were secure behind the fort. Now remember, New Orleans is 90 miles from the mouth of the Mississippi River. That's why I handed out the map again. Many people think New Orleans is on the coast. It's not. It's 90 miles upriver. It's a windy river and a very, very strong current. The Confederate government felt they were safe behind the two forts that guard the mouth of the river, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip. They also were in the process of building the two most massive ironclads that the Confederacy would undertake, the Louisiana and the Mississippi. One of the primary reasons that Farragut and Butler will make their move in April of 1862 is because they knew those two powerful ironclads were nearing completion, and they would have decimated the wooden Union blockading fleet. But there was also another critical mistake made. There was a chain across the river. There were several other half-hearted attempts to provide for the defense of the lower river to protect New Orleans, but they were a little bit conceited because something had happened in 1815, going back to 1815, that led to them feeling a false sense of security. Most of you know the story of the Battle of New Orleans on the plains of Chalmette. Most people do not realize that the British fleet, for several days, bombarded Fort St. Philip. Fort Jackson didn't exist yet, in an attempt to get past the fort and get upriver. They failed in that attempt, and so the British attack on New Orleans failed. Had that fleet gotten upriver, might have been a different story. But one big difference between the British fleet of 1815 and the Union fleet of 1862 is going to be overlooked. And what piece of technology was that? Steam. The British did a real good job bombarding the American defenses, but the wind was blowing the wrong way. Steam is going to reverse that and is going to be a major asset for the attacking Union forces. I want to read one quick quote for you that pretty much sums up how the Confederate defenders felt about preparing New Orleans for battle. It was written by a Confederate soldier, a cavalryman by the name of George Duval. He wrote, "We had armed and equipped ourselves, and the lady said we were the finest looking set of men in the army. If fine uniforms and good horses had anything to do with it, we were a fine body. We were ordered out to drill, which was every day. We would mount our fine horses, gallop out back of the city, and the first order we would receive from our commanding officer would be dismount, hitch horses, march, hunt, shade, begin playing." These are all handlers. There was not a company of cavalry in the Southern Army that obeyed more promptly than we did. We would remain in the shade until the cool of the evening when the orders would be given, cease playing, prepare to mount, march. When we would get back into the city, the people would come out, cheer, wave handkerchiefs, and present us with bouquets, for we had been out in the sun, out drilling in the hot sun, preparing ourselves to protect their homes from the northern invaders. This, unfortunately, is a pretty accurate statement. Confederate resources siphoned off, questionable morale in the Confederate defenders set the stage for Farragut's attack. In April of 1862, the most powerful fleet assembled by the United States Navy by that point in history blasted its way past St. Philip and Jackson. On April 25th, it arrives off the docks in New Orleans. The docks are in flames, and basically the two ironclads, the Louisiana, have been towed downriver, but it never had its engines. The Union Navy just blasts its way by it, never really is effective. And the mighty Mississippi, which would have been the greatest ironclad ever built by the Confederacy, floats past Farragut on fire, never to be finished. Farragut orders the surrender of the city, which is in total turmoil. Confederate forces are evacuating as quick as they can go. Now, the Army component of this attack still is busy down at the forts. Even though Farragut gets past them, forts haven't surrendered yet. That won't come for several days. Butler has to take, and this is a very important point I need you to keep in mind. When you talk to New Orleanians, like that family I was having dinner with, you get the idea that these Union soldiers that Butler had with him were on a parallel to Sherman's troops marching through Georgia. These battle-hardened, grizzled, tough Union soldiers. Nothing could be further from the truth. The majority of these 15,000 young boys are New England farm boys, many of whom shopkeepers, laborers, many of whom have never even fired a weapon in anger. And so they are far from the Union forces of 1864, 1865. But if you talk to someone in New Orleans today, you'd think they were the most tough Yankee soldiers that could possibly be presented. So please remember that fact. Basically, they have to take small boats, go up behind the forts. How many of you have been in a Louisiana swamp? Think of yourself as a New England farm boy. You're put in this rowboat, you're sent behind the forts into the swamps, you've got to jump into the mud, and as you're going toward the forts through this mud, the alligators are going by, the cottonmouths, and you're probably having a grand old time watching these critters go by. But they did. They crossed those swamps, and they cut off the forts from the rear, and eventually would force their surrender. Once that happens, Butler takes the first 500 of his men, 1,500 of his men, and on May the 1st, 1862, he proceeds upstream, and he lands at the base of Canal Street near the Customs House, makes the Customs House his new headquarters, and takes possession of the city of New Orleans. A high-ranking Union official at that time wrote the following quote, referring to Butler's arrival in New Orleans. "I guess we have finally found a hole into which to bury this Union elephant." With the surrender of the city, it becomes very clear that Butler has to assume control very quickly. Even though there is a very strong pro-Union segment of the population, the majority of it is still very pro-Confederate. And so on May the 2nd, the day after he's established his headquarters in the Customs House, he'll move over to the elaborate St. Charles Hotel, which is no longer standing. Customs House is. It's a remarkable building if you ever get a chance to see it. But he meets with Mayor Monroe at Gallier Hall over on Lafayette Square. Gallier Hall still stands today. And he goes to the mayor and he starts talking about the Union takeover of the city. The Confederates are still scampering out of town. Basically, the city's in turmoil. Outside in Lafayette Park, a large pro-Confederate crowd begins to gather. A very angry crowd. Basically, Butler begins to realize that this could get out of hand very, very quickly. He looks at Mayor Monroe and he says, "Mayor, you go out on that balcony and you disperse that crowd, or I'm going to do it for you." Mayor Monroe kind of laughs at him. Basically says, we're going to drive you out anyway, so I'm just going to let it happen. And Butler immediately shows what his rule is going to be like. He orders a battery, the 6th Maine, and their Napoleons, or 6 Napoleons, to rumble down St. Charles Avenue from Canal Street. They unlimber right there in Lafayette Park, or across from Lafayette Park. They load with double canister, and they aim their guns at the crowd. By my estimation, there is no doubt in my mind, if when General Butler turned to Mayor Monroe at this moment and said, "Mayor, one more chance, get out there and disperse that crowd now, or I will open fire." No doubt in my mind that if Mayor Monroe hadn't gone out on that balcony and dispersed that crowd, Butler would have ordered them to fire. And the loss of life would have been. Can you imagine 6 double canister Napoleons cutting loose in a confined area? It would have been horrible. Doesn't happen. Crowd disperses. I'm sure there was some very interesting, colorful language used, but there's no loss of life. Again, back to my original point. The next interesting thing that happens is Butler orders his proclamation of occupation of the city published by all the local newspapers. One local newspaper, the True Delta, refuses to publish anything. In fact, its editor will write in the paper, "As the first step of the commander of the federal troops in the possession of this city is indicative of the determination on his part to subject us to the supervision utterly subversive of the character of the fearless patriotism which the True Delta has ever maintained, we promise this much, and we will perform it, namely, to suspend our publication, even if our last crust be sacrificed by the act, rather than molt one feather of that independence which in presence of every discouragement and danger we have ever made our honest boast. We have no favors to ask. We have never asked or desired any from any party, and we are prepared to stand and fall with the fortunes of our adopted Louisiana. How many of you seen the movie The Godfather? Well, this little editorial really ticks General Butler off. So he goes to his staff and says, boys, I want you to pay this gentleman a visit. I want you to make him an offer he can't refuse. Now, I don't know, and history does not know exactly what the conversation may have been. I can only tell you that on May the 6th, the True Delta published his proclamation. So if something was said, those officers made that editor an offer he couldn't refuse. Now Butler has gained somewhat control of the city. What do you think the first major crisis is that he's going to face? You got a population of 170,000. I heard it. Food. Now this is going to tie back into what was in your quiz. It's not going to justify it. I'm going to try to explain a little bit to you. There's a certain degree of corruption to the story, but again, you've got to look at the ends and overlook the means. The population is starving. Butler immediately realizes he's got to get supplies into that city or people are going to starve to death. Remember, it's completely surrounded, except for the river, by Confederate-held territory. How many of you have been in New Orleans? What is New Orleans surrounded by? Water and swamps. There is no way easily in or out of that city. What he does, on May the 3rd, he issues orders for safe passage of any supplies previously bought by the city of New Orleans to be given basically protection and free passage through the Union lines to feed the city. He orders the mayor to continue to purchase outside supplies and allow it to come through the lines. He basically sends out a request to local farmers that goes out all around New Orleans, basically offering them free passage and protection if they will bring their supplies into the city for sale to the populace. Basically, he allows almost 2 steamers a day to come through the lines downriver, bringing those supplies in. Now, where he begins to make mistakes is he begins to issue permits to certain individuals to go out into Confederate territory or in abandoned territory in some cases, seize supplies, and bring them back into town to sell at immense profit. Biggest culprit in this case has already been mentioned. I said, you did my talk already for me, so his brother, Andrew Jackson Butler. Basically, he goes out, purchases cattle. Well, let me read to you one of the quotes, and this is from Parton's own autobiography of Butler. His brother, referring to the general, his butler, Colonel A.J. Butler, found himself, by action of the Senate, without employment in New Orleans, and having both capital and credit at command, embarked in the business of bringing cattle from Texas to the great advantage of the city and his own considerable profit. Now, whether Benjamin actually gained anything by this corrupt price gouging, still open to debate. Did he? Probably. But the bulk of the money was gotten by his brother. Now, Benjamin, to his credit, would defend his brother's actions all the way until Andrew Jackson Butler will die in 1864. So we will probably never know exactly what the truth may have been. But the corruption is unquestionable. Mr. Girardi, I'd like you to answer this question. I'm going to read you something, and I want your law enforcement opinion on it. When General Banks replaces General Butler in December of 1862, the following note is sent by A.J. Butler to General Banks. Dear Sir, if you will allow our commercial program to be carried out as projected previous to your arrival in this department, giving the same support and facilities as your predecessor, I am authorized on obtaining your assent to place at your disposal $100,000. What does it sound like? Just a little bit of a bribe. Yeah. Now, I have very little good to say about Nathaniel Banks, but I have to give him credit on this one. He basically tore that up and booted A.J. Butler's butt out of New Orleans as fast as he could get rid of it. Probably because he wanted to bring his own cronies in. That's a story for another time. But, how many people died of starvation in New Orleans during this occupation period? 0. Again, you may not like the means, but it worked. He averted starvation. Now, the Confederates never counterattacked New Orleans. One, because it's very difficult, but they were counting on something else that would be their ally in destroying them. Remember, go back to the New England Farm Boy statement. What ally do you think the Confederates were hoping on as late spring, summer begins to arrive in New Orleans? Yellow fever is the one I'm looking for. They figured these Yankee New Englanders would start dropping like flies as soon as the yellow fever period began. Now, this is one of the ways you have to look at. General Butler had an amazing way of being very lucky. He starts looking around the city and he sees this huge number of unemployed individuals. So he gets his hands on a listing of all the surrounding people, all the people in New Orleans who contributed to the Confederate Defense Fund. And I think he sends the same group of guys that talked to that newspaper editor out to talk to these guys and says basically, you know, we're here now. Why don't you chip in a few bucks so that we can help clean up the city? Well, what he does with that money is he begins to hire all these out-of-work seamen, all these out-of-work laborers, and he puts them to work. How many of you have been in New Orleans after Mardi Gras? Yeah, you know where I'm going with this. The city that Butler takes over is filthy. Dead animals in the canals and in the drainage ditches. It's below sea level. Sewage is probably just laying around all over the place in any low spot that they can find. He puts all these individuals to work cleaning up all this stagnant water, the ditches, the canals, the drainage basins. And what does that do that we now know from medical history? It wipes out the breeding ponds of the mosquitoes that cause the yellow fever. There will be 3 cases of yellow fever that summer in New Orleans. None of them fatal. And so the great ally the Confederates were counting on will never take place. Now, the woman order. Let's look at this. Let's look at it for what it is. If I move, am I gonna, you okay? Okay. Silverware being thrown around. Think of what I've told you so far. Hostile population, green soldiers. Butler had banned the showing or wearing of any pro-Confederate symbols. The women of New Orleans continued to wear those symbols on their blouses, on their dresses. They continued to insult Union soldiers at every possibility. Let me give you a couple of examples. This is from Butler's own autobiography. Many of the women of New Orleans, particularly those with aristocratic pretensions, missed few opportunities to be annoying or even grossly insulting to Union officers. Unpleasant remarks were commonly made about the officers within their hearing. Some ladies threw garbage, including rotten eggs, at officers. Some spat in officers' faces. One woman emptied the contents of a chamber pot upon the heads of Captain Farragut and an army officer as they walked under her house. At another time, the general would write, another time, 5 or 6 women on a balcony whirled around with something between a shriek and a sneer as I rode past the house. Turning to my aide, I loudly commented, those women obviously know which end of them looks the best. Anybody got an idea where I'm going with this? Eventually, one of these insults was going to flare up. One of these soldiers was going to snap. One of these women was going to be injured, or worse. And the Southern populace in support of that woman were going to respond. And there was going to be bloodshed. Butler realized it was a desperate situation. It was extremely volatile. And so he makes the decision to issue Order Number 28. On the back side of the handout I gave you, I have Order Number 28. And I want to, he sends it to Mayor Monroe. and then releases it to the public. Let's take a look at it. As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women calling themselves ladies of New Orleans in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter, when any female shall by word, gesture, or movement insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her avocation. Pretty volatile stuff. I'll read some of the reactions to it in a moment. Guess what, folks? It works. There are a few isolated circumstances. A few women will actually be arrested and imprisoned down at Fort Jackson. But the flare-up that Butler greatly feared never happens. You may not like the content, but I put the idea to you that it saved lives and prevented a more horrible situation. The reaction is massive. Mayor Monroe will write on May 16th to Butler, "Your officers and soldiers are permitted by the terms of this order to place any construction they may please upon the conduct of our wives and daughters, and upon such construction to offer them atrocious insults, to give a license to the officers and soldiers of your command to commit outrages such as are indicated in your order upon defenseless women is, in my judgment, a reproach to the civilization, not to say the Christianity of the age in whose name I make this protest." How do you think Butler reacted to that? Big bags, Mayor Monroe right there. He's out the door, and martial law is officially enforced. The military government takes control of New Orleans. But the condemnations don't stop there. Governor Moore of Louisiana would write, "History records incidents of cities sacked, of inhuman atrocities committed upon the women of a conquered town. But in the instance, in modern times at least, without the brutal ravishers suffering punishment from the hands of their own commanders, it is reserved for a federal general to invite his soldiers to the perpetration of outrages at the mention of which the blood recoils in horror, to quicken the impulse of their sensual instincts by the suggestion of transparent excuses for their gratification, and to add to an infamy already well merited these crowning titles of a panderer to lust and desecrator of virtue." Yeah, good press, right? Mary Boynton Chestnut would write the following in her diary. Now, this is important because it feeds again into the quiz. "There is said to be an order from Butler turning over the women of New Orleans to his soldiers. Thus is the measure of his shortcomings filled. We thought that generals always restrained by shot or sword, if need be, the brutal soldiery. This hideous, cross-eyed beast orders his men to treat the ladies of New Orleans as women of the town, and to punish them, he says, for their insolence." This is the first recorded use of one of the two names that were mentioned in your quiz. This is the first time he's referred to as Beast Butler, and it sticks. Price is put on his head. European countries condemn the act, but as I said earlier, it works. Not to be outdone, the ladies of New Orleans, as mentioned in your quiz, will have the last word. As a retaliation for the woman order, they have General Butler's portrait painted into the bottom of their chamber pots. And as you mentioned, these are available on sale as a fundraiser for the Louisiana Civil War Museum. I was one of the ones who helped come up with that idea. It's one of our best sellers down there. So, the only original one I have ever seen is in the Alabama State Archives. Needless to say, a lot of them didn't make it through the whole war. I got a hunch that they got smashed on a regular basis. But you can fill in the rest of that story yourselves. Having married a Louisianan and gotten to know the ladies of Louisiana pretty well, they're a pretty they'll get the last word in. Don't even try it out. Do it. Now, I'm sorry?
There's women everywhere.
Yeah, Louisianans they're unique. And I think Larry can support me on that one. William Mumford. Again, I said I could just basically skip the rest of my program, but I'm going to give you a little more information about what happened before Mr. Mumford. William Mumford was an out-of-work gambler. When Farragut first takes possession of the city, he orders that the United States flag be placed above U.S. property, the customs house, the mint, but basically he doesn't have the force to be able to keep it up there. He has to go back, he's going to have to go back to the ships. There aren't enough of them yet. And remember, Butler's busy trying to get the forts captured. William Mumford decides he's going to go to the U.S. Mint and tear down the U.S. flag. This does not make Farragut very happy. He basically tells the city and Mayor Monroe, put those flags back up or I will open fire on the city. No doubt in my mind that Farragut would have bombarded the city had the flags not gone back up. Now that might have been the end of the story. But William Mumford was a drunk, a gambler, out of work, and he kept using his notoriety to get people to buy him drinks. He's going around town shooting his mouth off all over the place about what he did. He kept his mouth shut, he probably would have lived. But eventually, just like with the woman order, just like with the artillery pieces in the crowd, basically Butler has to shut this guy up. And he's got to make an example of him. So he has Mumford arrested. He is charged with basically endangering the city by tearing the flag down. He almost caused Farragut to open fire and bombard the city. He's also charged with basically trying to start a riot. He is convicted by a military tribunal and sentenced to death. I will read you the final order. June 5th, 1862. William B. Mumford, a citizen of New Orleans, having been convicted before a military commission of treason and an overt act thereof of tearing down the United States flag from a public building of the United States for the purpose of inciting other civil-minded, evil-minded persons to further resistance to the laws and to the arms of the United States, after said flag was placed there by Commodore Farragut of the United States Navy. It is here ordered that he be executed according to the sentence of the said military commission on Saturday, June 7th, instant, between the hours of 8 and noon. The scaffold is erected on the grounds of the United States Mint, and Mumford meets his fate. As pointed out in your quiz, Butler was never happy about having to do this. Again, he felt it was necessary. Again, it succeeds. No riot. But he feels very guilty about it. And one thing to add about, not only does he supply money to Mumford's widow, he eventually gets her a job in the U.S. Pension Office, if I remember correctly, in Washington. So he remains in constant contact with the widow after his death. On that very same day in June, and this is the point I'm trying to get across to you about General Butler, there are 6 Confederate soldiers that are also supposed to be executed that day. They had been captured when the city fell. They had been paroled, gone back into Confederate service, captured a second time, and sentenced to death. Where are my Civil War trivia folks? What's the missing piece in that story? Why were they sentenced to death? They were paroled but not exchanged. Butler had these men brought before him. He had a conversation with them, and he suddenly realized these poor young, remember this is 1862, it's early in the war. These poor guys had no clue. All they knew is they'd been captured, they went home, they heard from their officers, and they called them back to duty. They had no clue what exchange meant. And Butler just said, yeah, this is wrong. And he commuted the sentences and basically just turned them over to prisoners of war. So here you see an iron fist on one hand and leniency on the other. This is Benjamin Butler. And I urge you, if I get you, whet your appetite a little bit tonight, you read the story of his whole life. He's a lousy general, but he's a fascinating human being, and the things he accomplishes in his lifetime. And I urge you to study him in a little more detail and ignore the military part. Now, as the time wears on in New Orleans, Butler is faced with an even greater challenge. He has the job of issuing permits and passes, as I said earlier, for those that go between the lines. And he suddenly realizes that people are beginning to take advantage of him. In his own autobiography, he talks about women, especially, that would come to him and just plead day after day after day. Please, my family is starving. Let me get some food. Let me get some clothes out across the lakes and the water. Let me go out to my family. I'll come right back, I promise. Well, apparently, Butler had his own little, you know, these, again, the guys that went to the newspaper, the guys that collected the money. These guys were pretty good detectives. Well, one of these cases especially, and I'm sure there were more, after weeks and weeks of a woman who was absolutely a wonderful actress convinced Butler to let her go through the lines, one of his officers went down to look at her boat and basically had false hips on it. It had hollowed out sides. And when the officer looked at it, he found all sorts of medicine and other contraband bound for the Confederacy in that boat. She was a smuggler. This is what Butler was up against. Because in many cases, he had to stop sending these passes out to civilians. And in some cases, there were legitimate cases of people needing to reach their relatives on the other side. And in many cases, one of the ones, again, in his autobiography, he writes about another woman who came to him with the same circumstances. And she just went frantic, and he constantly had to turn her down. She finally snapped one day in his office and had a complete mental breakdown and never recovered. This is the kind of strain he was under on a day-to-day basis. And I put to you the idea that no Civil War officer, either side, was ever given a more difficult task, militarily and civilian-wise, than General Butler was given in controlling New Orleans. And these are the examples that I'm throwing out to you. Now, General Butler, the general. He's got military responsibilities too, which he doesn't do very well at. After the capture of New Orleans, Confederate defenses are in disarray. With the assistance of Farragut, Union forces are able to move up the Mississippi River pretty quickly. They take Donaldsonville, they take Baton Rouge, they take Natchez, they get all the way up to Vicksburg. Federal forces actually land across the river from Vicksburg. The Vicksburg defenses are not the condition they are by 1863. They are still in a very raw state. Can you imagine how the story of the Civil War might be different if General Butler's troops had taken Vicksburg in the summer of 1862? No Grant campaign? Definitely would have changed the story of our Civil War. But General Williams, who's commanding the forward operation for General Butler, decides to land on the river side, the Louisiana side of the river. He decides he's going to dig a bypass canal, the remains of which can still be seen today. It's referred to by the park by Grant's Canal, because Grant tried to finish it later. I still call it Williams's Canal. I've got a prejudice toward the earlier phase. But now disease does take its toll. Not only among the Union soldiers trying to dig the canal, but among a huge number of African Americans who are basically oppressed from surrounding plantations to assist in digging that canal. They start dropping in massive numbers. They're very soon more sick, too few sick to continue the work. General Williams has to abandon his canal, move back downriver to Baton Rouge. There, in early August of 1862, Confederate forces under John Breckinridge will counterattack and attempt to drive the Federals out of Baton Rouge. The battle will be a stalemate, but the Confederates are unsuccessful in retaking the city, but the Yankees, now in fear of their supply line being cut, abandon the city and move all the way back into the defenses of New Orleans. So all the gains that General Butler initially enjoyed are reversed. And for the remainder of his time in New Orleans, he will remain content with just protecting the city and its main surrounding areas. And so his efforts as a general were a complete disaster. Now, one of the things that happens in this time period that's very important is, remember, the Emancipation Proclamation hasn't come out yet. But there's a group of soldiers, I have a book up here, and I mentioned them in my talk in September, that I find their story to be one of the most fascinating stories of the Civil War. They are the Native Guards. These are African Americans, many of them slave owners themselves, who volunteered to fight for the state of Louisiana and the Confederacy at the outbreak of the war. They are accepted into Louisiana state service, but they are never accepted into Confederate service. After the city falls, the Confederacy doesn't know what to do with these men. And so they basically disband the unit and they go home. Remember I told you Butler's got 15,000 green soldiers. He starts looking around New Orleans for help. He hears about the Native Guards, one of the best drilled, best equipped militia units the state of Louisiana had. I think he sends out the same group of guys again. I don't know who these guys were, but they were something, these staff officers. They convinced the Native Guards, they dumped you. Come fight for us. And many of them do. Their ranks reinforced by escaped slaves. They will soon become a mixture of free African Americans and former slaves. They will eventually form the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Native Guards. And in Port Hudson, in the spring of 1863, before the 54th Mass makes its assault on Battery Wagner in July of 1863, the 1st and 3rd Native Guards, I believe, May 24th? 27th. Okay, I was close. I've been gone for a few years. See, I told you Larry knows more than me. The Native Guards, the 1st and 3rd, will participate in the assault on on the Port Hudson Works. Really the first large-scale effort of black African-American troops in the Civil War. But they don't get any of the press. They are a fascinating unit which will serve throughout the duration of the war for the Union cause, and their story is little remembered. The one book I have up here that I urge you all to read if you want to learn more about them. So Butler has actually jumped the gun on the Emancipation Proclamation, but of course on January 1, now that Banks is in charge of New Orleans, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Native Guards will be incorporated into the Union forces officially. Now Butler, again, trying to show the different sides of this man, he had a very interesting sense of humor. And I've got to tell you my favorite Butler story that takes place about this time. Quick-witted himself, Butler enjoyed quick wit in others. While he was in command of the Army of the Gulf in New Orleans during the Civil War, a Union soldier of Irish extraction died. The man's comrades prepared to bury him in St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery, but neglected to consult the parish priest, Father Mullen, in the matter. Not having been given any proof or evidence that the man was entitled to a Catholic funeral, Father Mullen refused permission for the digging of a grave in the cemetery. A complaint was lodged against Father Mullen, which led to his being ordered to appear before General Butler. The priest reported and asked, "Why have I been summoned?" The general said he had been credibly informed that Father Mullen had refused to bury a Union soldier. Butler was highly amused at the priest's reply. "Your information, General, is entirely wrong. I assure you that nothing would make me happier than to bury him all." Got him off the hook. Now, the other nickname, Spoons. Going back to the quiz. You were on target with that. Where that name seems to begin to originate is shortly after the capture of New Orleans. The first Confederate commander of New Orleans, David Twiggs, a Mexican war veteran, had been given a great, wonderful collection of silver by Congress as a reward for his service in the Mexican War. Well, when the city was evacuated, Twiggs left that silver behind. Butler decided it was the property of the people of the United States, and he grabbed it. Where it ever ended up, I have no idea. But then he decided when the Confiscation Acts were passed, anybody that was pro-Confederate that might have silver around, maybe this is a good idea. And so silver starts disappearing in very large amounts. How much, again, he actually gained from it, open to debate. But that is where the second nickname originates, that nickname of Spoons, because of his liberal interpretation of the Confiscation Acts. And I'm going to read something to you in a moment that basically sums it up. It comes from a newspaper in Boston, which I assume was an anti-Butler newspaper. It's dated January 11, 1863, which would be shortly after Butler's being relieved in New Orleans. Below, 3 ships, 2 steamers, and 1 bark. These vessels will arrive at Long Wharf today about 9 o'clock. They contain the immense wealth accumulated by General Butler and staff. I love the staff. I gotta find out someday who those guys are. While stationed in New Orleans, which is estimated at about $6 million. There are 2 boots full of diamonds, 1 tea chest of children's silver mugs, 1 cradle full of ladies' gold hairpins, 2 bandboxes of pin cushions, 1 coal box of mosaic brooches, 2 clothes baskets of altar ornaments, 17 valises of gold and silver watches, 21 strawberry baskets of gold rings stolen from the ladies of New Orleans while walking in the streets, 2 sugar boxes of silver door plates and knobs, 1 stocking full of decanter labels, 16 sugar boxes of gold pens and silver pencil cases, 21 pianos, 1 for each member of the staff, 2 church organs, 1 a little out of tune, 1 hat, 5 poodles, 6 stallions, and many other articles too numerous to mention. Colonel, and then there's a blank, on his return will bring the rest of the booty. So take it for what it's worth. Did he bring all that back with him? We do know that under the Confiscation Acts, when you have a ship of supplies come in to New Orleans, and you don't have anything to send it back out on, what is it lacking? You got any sailors in the group? Ballast. What Butler did is a lot of this property that he seized, he wrote off as ballast, put it on these ships, seized cotton, seized merchandise, and it went away. It went back north. What happened to it when it got back north? I'll leave that to further researchers sometime in the future. Did he get a kickback on it? Again, I leave it to your discretion. Finally, we're coming to the end of these 7 months. What's finally going to break, the straw that's going to break the camel's back, takes place in early December. Late November, early December, there are a couple of occurrences. What is Lincoln's greatest fear at the beginning of the Civil War, those first couple of years?
The British and French helping.
European recognition. Not only the British and the French, but all the other European countries recognizing the Confederacy. Butler gets wind that gold and silver and medicines and other supplies, contraband again, is being held in the consulates of these European nations in New Orleans with the intention of it being smuggled through the lines to support the Confederacy. He acts on his own. He storms several of these consulates, and in every one of them he finds this contraband headed for the Confederacy. But when he storms the Danish consulate, that's the final last straw. For some reason the Danes, or had enough influence, I guess, I don't know why, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back. He is condemned for this act. Basically, when you storm a consulate, what are you doing? You're invading the territory of a foreign nation. Lincoln could no longer tolerate this. I had someone in Milwaukee last night ask me, well, didn't he understand the position he was putting Lincoln in? Yes. Did he care? No. Because again, you're talking about a pre-war Democrat that voted for Jefferson Davis 50 times, who has now become a radicalized Republican who will do everything in his power to destroy the Confederacy, no matter what. He doesn't care what Lincoln thinks, by the way. Basically, he's going to do what he thinks is best. Done it his whole life, and will continue to do it for the remainder of his life. That's the final straw. Lincoln has no choice but to recall him and replace him and get him out of New Orleans and basically remove command altogether for quite some time. When he leaves New Orleans, he really, I don't know if he's living in a fairy tale world or what he was looking at, but basically he recalls the Lincoln issues the order to replace him with General Banks on November the 8th. Banks will arrive in New Orleans on December the 14th. Butler will depart on December the 24th. I want to read to you his final proclamation to the people of New Orleans. I shall speak in no bitterness, because I am not conscious of any single personal animosity. Again, I don't know what world he was living in. These are his words. Commanding the army in the Gulf, I found you captured, but not surrendered. Conquered, but not orderly. Relieved from the presence of an army, but incapable of taking care of yourselves. I restored order, punished crime, opened commerce, brought provisions to your starving people, reformed your currency, and gave you quiet protection such as you had not enjoyed in many years. But he's going to have one more parting shot for the people of New Orleans, according to legend. How many of you have been to Jackson Square? What is the dominant statue in that park? What's inscribed on the side of that statue? What words? Well, according to legend, and I love this story, before he departed, Butler had a group of craftsmen, stonemasons, sneak into Jackson Square and scribble a little message on that marker, which is there to this day. What do you think those words are? Anybody remember? I heard it.
The Union must be preserved.
You got it. The Union must and shall be preserved. Was it Butler's final shot to the people of New Orleans? Again, I leave that to your discretion. So in conclusion, I put to you the idea of the very events that I've described to you over the past few minutes. You may not agree with the methodology. You may not agree with the abrasiveness of them. But my point to you all is it worked, it saved lives, it may have enhanced his personal wealth, can't defend that. But it protected the city, it could have very easily have been destroyed, and gave us the wonderful gem that's there today. Butler, as we know, goes on to continued failings as a general. That's a whole talk in its own right. But he goes on to do a lot of other things. Governor of Massachusetts, congressman, very successful lawyer. He dies a very wealthy man. He's a very talented individual, besides what he may have gotten illegally. One of my favorite stories to tell about Ben Butler, as a conclusion, is the day he dies from pneumonia in Washington, D.C. He dies after returning from arguing a patent case before the Supreme Court. He's arguing that case and that patent for one of the most famous American inventors. Where are my trivia experts? Anybody want to guess who it is? Thomas Edison. Exactly right. He was a very, very successful lawyer. Very, very, very well thought of. And a final thought. You don't cross Ben Butler. How many of you realize that when Lincoln was looking around for a running mate in 1864, that this wasn't on the quiz, he gave Butler a serious look. He's looking for a Democrat, and Butler's flip-flopping all over the place. He kind of serves both purposes. Imagine how history might have been different if Ben Butler had been his vice president choice instead of Andrew Johnson. This really ticked off Ben Butler. You didn't cross this man. What happens to Andy Johnson? He's impeached. Who writes the articles of impeachment? Congressman Ben Butler. On that, questions?
Obviously was very effective in administering the world. Couldn't they have done something other than moving them all together?
Could they have done something other than removing them altogether? Probably not. There was such an outcry and such fear of the European powers basically entering the war on the side of the Confederacy. Lincoln had to make an example of it.
How many consuls were there?
Oh, everybody. Almost every European nation. New Orleans is an extremely diverse city. People don't realize that it is the second largest port of immigration into this nation after New York City. It has basically populations that represent every corner of the world. So almost every European nation has a consulate in New Orleans. None of them are happy with Butler. Yes, sir.
How did the actual prostitutes react to?
I have no idea. Gentleman asked, well, how did the actual prostitutes in New Orleans react to the order? I have no idea. Larry, what they
Expected to be compared to
No one has ever asked me that. That one, that's an interesting question. That would, obviously, the business flourished. We got an occupying army. I'm quite sure business was very good. Again, going back to your question, you've got to look at the population of New Orleans. It is extremely diverse. Every country in the world is represented in that population. As I said, it's the second largest melting pot after the city of New York. So yeah, I'm quite sure that there was no trouble finding customers. But that's got me with that one.
So why was he effective in anticipating some of these problems and dealing with them, maybe some unorthodox?
Good question.
But he was so much of a failure on the military side.
Excellent question. Let's see if I can get you guys can work this out for me. The question was, why was he so effective dealing with this population situation, but such a failure on the battlefield? Well, he didn't have the military training to begin with. What training he does have answers your question. He is the commander of the Massachusetts State Militia prior to the war. What is the Massachusetts militia engaged in prior to the Civil War? What battle experience, if you want to call it that, does he actually have?
Baltimore.
No, I mean going before the war. What type of unrest is he used to dealing with? What type of civil unrest? Think Pullman. Labor. His experience up to that point was dealing with labor riots in the industrial belt of Lowell, Massachusetts, around Lowell, Boston. That is where he got his experience in dealing with crowds. And I think that's what fed into his behavior in New Orleans. I'm telling you, he's an interesting man. Yes, sir.
How is it that he was a partisan of Davis in 1860, coming from Massachusetts?
He was a very pro-Democrat, very solid Democrat.
You could be for Douglas or other Democrats.
Yeah, he said he was totally supportive of Davis. Probably saw Douglas as a rival. Larry, jump in here. What would you think?
I don't think anybody's ever pinned down why he backed Davis, because he was not for Breckinridge or a lot of other people along the gamut, and certainly the foremost supporters of Davis.
So I don't know that we really know for sure.
But was it common that people in Massachusetts would name their kids Andrew Jackson? Andrew Jackson.
Oh, yeah.
If your father fought under him in New Orleans,
Yeah.
Yes.
Or he was a successful
Regardless of whether
privateer.
you came from the New England.
Yeah, he was a successful, and this is where we disagree. Having managed that battlefield for many years, I have never found a primary source that places the father in Jackson's command. There's the rumors and legend is that he was there. He was a very successful privateer during the War of 1812. But whether or not he was there, that's what we were debating about. That's why I've asked if he has a primary source, I'd like to see it. Because that's one of the questions
So
we
boys
can
were
answer.
named Andrew Jackson from all over the country.
Angie Jackson, especially among the Democratic Party, the rise of Jacksonian democracy, he was a huge hero all across the country. The exact opposite of Abraham Lincoln and the Whigs, if you want to look at it that way. Yes, sir.
2 points. First of all, as Bruce Catton pointed out in The Coming Fury, before the war, Jefferson Davis actually was known as something of a moderate, and he wasn't considered one of the radical fire eaters. And I think that's part of why Ben Butler was a supporter of his.
Good point.
And second, Also, the work that Butler was actually doing in New Orleans essentially involved political rather than military. Running the city government. That's essentially political stuff. And it's not like taking troops out into the field and managing them battle. These were skills that Butler, being a political general, didn't have.
Correct. You're absolutely correct. That's why you said Williams upriver with that forward part of the Army. And then I guess that goes back to my original point of my whole talk, is that no greater challenge was ever given to any one officer than to provide these two functions of both civil leadership and military leadership. One of which I think he did real well, one of which he botched completely. He hated West Pointers, by the way, for those of you that may not know that. As again from the quiz, he was denied entry into West Point. He had little use for West Pointers.
What was the correction?
Yo, you did not cross Ben Butler. I think I can safely say that without any hesitation. You got on his bad side, you were, yeah, you didn't get off of it. You didn't get off that list. Yes, Cindy?
After the women's order and all the southern papers, the politicians, Mary Chestnut said all this bad things were going to happen to the women of New Orleans because of this. Are there any records?
Yeah. I mean, there's no record of anything bad happening. There were no assaults. There were no. I know there were a couple of arrests. A couple of women did continue to throw insults. A couple of arrests. They were taken down to Fort Jackson and held there.
No, I mean from the Union soldiers.
None that I know. Larry, did you ever come across a reference to an actual assault of any kind? I never have.
No.
Yeah. Nope. Again, back to my point. It worked, in my opinion.
Anybody else?
Was, this caption, it says, I never knew what protectiveness was until I learned.
I found that somewhere. I don't remember where exactly I found it, but I think that is the most perfect Butler quote. It's, to me, that sums the man up. I honestly don't remember where I...
It was like to a specific anecdote.
No, it's just something I stumbled across once under that picture in a caption somewhere in a book, and I just said, I gotta share that with people. That's Ben Butler to me. He can give a dang what anybody thought of him. He's gonna do it my way, and that's just the way it is. Yes, sir.
Butler was serving in the Massachusetts legislature. He disagreed with a ruling that the Speaker of the House made, and he was heard muttering, I should like to knife the old cuss.
Wouldn't surprise me. Now, I will end with one other thing. Very powerful men have a tendency to take advantage of that power. One of the most admirable things I find about Ben Butler, and this figures in a little bit to his loyalty to his brother. He was an extremely devoted husband, father. He was as loyal to the very opposite of the enemies. He was as devout and loyal a friend as you could ever ask for. Never sways from his family, remains steadfast in support of them for his entire life. Never wavers. Got to say that about him.
He sounds like Mayor Daley the other.